Herman and I go way back. I first met him at Louisiana State University when he was there in the economics department, and I was there in the marine science department. And we, while there, started together the journal Ecological Economics and the Society for Ecological Economics. Herman then moved to the World Bank. Today he's going to talk about from a failed growth economy to a steady state economy. So take it away, Herman.
Bob, I'm sure that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you for it. I couldn't hear most of it. I've got my volume turned up all the way. But anyway, I guess you can hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. And I'm so glad I didn't have to get on an airplane to go up and talk to you, although I'm sure I would enjoy being there once I was there. Just read in the paper this morning how the air traffic mess in Europe, thanks to the Icelandic volcano, has increased teleconferencing enormously. So that's a good thing. That'll lower the carbon footprint for all of us. What I'd like to do is just go over some basic policy recommendations and then open up for discussion. Although there won't be much discussion if I can't hear you. At least you can discuss among yourselves. But what I would like to talk about are basically the 10 policy suggestions that I've offered in the solutions article. And I'd like to go into a little more detail about one of them, namely the one on fractional reserve banking, because financial reform is very topical right now. And I think that one needs to be spelled out a little more and discussed, and would like to know what you think about it. So of course, the idea of what's the goal behind these 10 policies? The goal is to move towards a steady state economy. That is a system that maintains a constant metabolic flow, beginning with resource depletion, ending with pollution of waste sinks, and keeps this flow within the assimilative and regenerative capacities of the ecosystem. Of course, 10 policies is an arbitrary number. You may want to suggest consolidating some or extending to 11 or 12 or whatever, but it's just a way of being specific. 1, 2, 3, then we know what we're talking about. So the first policy suggestion is one that ecological economists have been making for quite a few years, and that is the cap auction trade system for basic resources. And we started out not calling it cap and trade. We started out calling it a depletion quota auction. That is, and I emphasize that auction, and I now would like to refer generally to cap auction trade systems, because the politicians have kind of limited the auction. They've resorted to a kind of giveaway of the basic resource rents that we're trying to capture and redistribute through the auction process. Well, caps, the quotas, limit the biophysical scale of the economy. And you can put the caps either on depletion or pollution, whichever is more limiting, whichever is easiest to monitor. Auctioning the quotas captures the scarcity rent for more equitable redistribution. And this policy, I think, allows trade to establish efficient allocation to the highest uses of the basic resource. And the policy has the advantage of transparency and of straightforwardly limiting the quantity. It says that you can't just go on getting more and more out, even if you're willing to pay the price. because the quantity is limited. So caps or quotas, limits to the throughput, especially fossil fuels, and the quotas should be applied, I think, mainly at the depletion or the input end, because depletion is spatially more concentrated than pollution. Also, putting it at the input end means that the higher prices of the resource will be reflected all the way up the production chain and increase efficiency, force increasing efficiency in that way. Well, what else can we say about ownership of the quotas? Is initially public. The government auctions them to the individuals and firms. Revenues go to the Treasury, are used to replace regressive taxes, such as the payroll tax, or to reduce income tax on the lowest incomes. Once purchased at auction, the quotas can be freely bought and sold by third parties, just as can the resources. So the trading allows efficient allocation, the auction serves just distribution, and the cap serves the goal of scale, of limiting scale. Well, the same logic can be applied to limiting the offtake from fisheries and forests. I mean, with renewable resources, the quota should be set to approximate sustainable yield. For non-renewables, the sustainable rates of absorption of the resulting pollution might be the criterion, or of the projected estimated development of renewable resource substitutes. Substitutes using renewable resources may provide a criterion. So that's, now I know a lot of people have been talking about the problem. People are very afraid that if Wall Street gets a hold of these tradable quotas, they're going to do something disastrous with them. Well, yes, I think that's something to worry about, but they don't need tradable quotas for doing something disastrous. I mean, they've already been making bets on debts and calling them assets under the heading of derivatives and doing all sorts of crazy things like that. So Wall Street can do something crazy with anything, and I think that's something to watch out for. I don't consider that, as some people do, a particular problem of the cap auction trade system. I know James Hansen, whom I admire very much, has strongly condemned the cap auction trade and seems to think that that taxes would be much better. Well, maybe so, but taxes too are subject to all sorts of abuse, loopholes, and various other things. Nevertheless, the second policy suggestion moves in that direction: ecological tax reform, something that ecological economists and Bob has written about this quite a bit as well, have talked about. The idea here is to shift the tax base away from value added and onto the resource flow. What is value added? Value added is labor and capital income. It is what labor and capital contributes to value by rearranging the resource flow and making it more useful, by transforming raw resources into finished product. That's value added. Who is it that adds the value? Labor and capital. If you tax value added, you're taxing labor and capital. We should not tax value added. That's something we want more of. We should instead tax the resource flow through carbon tax or something equivalent, other kinds of resource taxes. So ecological tax reform then can be an alternative or a supplement to the cap auction trade system. I mean, there's some kinds of resources which are better dealt with through taxes, others which are better dealt with through quotas. So we can be a little pragmatic about that and not have to a priori say one is necessarily always better than the other. One other thing about value added. Value added is simultaneously created in the very process of production, simultaneously created and distributed in the process of production. So economists argue that there is really no such thing as an aggregate pie of value added to be independently distributed according to ethical principles. As Kenneth Boulding has put it, says instead of a pie, there are only a lot of little tarts consisting of the value added by different people or different countries, and then blindly aggregated by some statistician into some abstract pie that doesn't really exist as an independent totality. So if one wants to redistribute this imaginary pie, he should appeal to the generosity of those who bake larger tarts to share with those who bake smaller tarts, and not to the notion of some invidious comparison of equal participation in this abstract, fictitious common inheritance. Well, that's sort of the hard-nosed economist position. I agree with that. I think it's true, except true as far as it goes, but it leaves out something very important. In our one-eyed focus on value added, we economists have neglected that to which value is added. That to which value added, of course, is the resource throughput. Resources have been considered simply inert building blocks that you just add value to and that are indestructible. That's not the case. Resources really already are not indestructible building blocks. They are low entropy matter energy, which is scarce, and it requires that characteristic of low entropy matter energy in order to be able to add value to the resource flow. Without that, it's rather difficult to add value to ashes blowing in the wind and the dissipated heat in the oceans. Labor and capital, the value added has to be added to something, and the quality and quantity of that something is very important. So there's a real and important sense in which the original contribution of nature is indeed a pie, that is a pre-existing undivided totality that we all share as an inheritance. It is not an aggregation of little tarts that we each baked ourselves. Rather, it is the seed, soil, sunlight, and rain, not to mention the gene pools and suitable climate, from which the wheat and apples grew, that we converted into tarts by our labor and capital. So the claim for equal access to nature's gifts is not the invidious coveting of what our nature produced by her own labor and abstinence. The focus of our demands for income to redistribute to the poor, therefore, should be on the value of the contribution of nature. The original value of that to which further value is added by labor and capital. I don't mean to say that we should never share value added, but before we face the difficult task of taxing away the value that someone added and giving it to someone else, we ought to redistribute the value added by nature, which is a common inheritance and should be treated as such. So currently, I believe there's a lot of discussion in the newspapers about a VAT tax, a value-added tax, in the United States. I'm going to suggest that that's a very bad idea and that we really ought to move in the direction of taxing the resource flow. I know that Europeans have a value-added tax, and Europeans are usually smarter than we are, but not always, and in this case, I think they're not. Okay, number 3 policy, limit the range of inequality in income distribution. I mean, a lot of our policies are aimed at changing the distribution of income in one way or another through all sorts of manipulations. Just take the bull by the horns and let's say there's a minimum income and a maximum income. Without aggregate growth, poverty reduction requires redistribution. Now, how do you deal with redistribution? Well, complete inequality, one person owns everything, that's unfair. And complete equality is unfair because people make different contributions. And so I think the reasonable way of approaching this problem is to seek fair limits to the range of inequality. What is a range of inequality which is fair and within which, there's justification, and beyond which there's really not much justification. So if you take that approach, you might then ask, well, what would that range be? The civil service, the military, and the university, current institutions that we might look at, they all manage with a range of inequality of about a factor of 15 to 20 in salaries within those institutions. That is to say, the president of the university, or perhaps it's a basketball coach at the top and the lowest paid graduate instructor at the bottom, there's a factor of like 15 to 20 and so forth. Well, corporate America has a range of 500 or more between the top and the bottom in the payment scale. Many industrial nations have a range of below 25. Well, could we in the United States not, say, try to limit the range to a factor of 100 and see how it works? People who have reached the limit could either work for nothing at the margin if they enjoy their work, or they could devote their time to hobbies or public service. The demand left unmet by those at the top could then be met by those who have not yet reached the maximum. But I think a sense of community in a democracy is very hard to maintain with such vast differences in income and wealth. Rich and poor separated by a factor of 500 seem to me to become almost different species. They probably can't even interbreed anymore after a little while. The main justification for such differences has been that they stimulate growth, and that growth will make everyone richer and richer, on, and so forth. Well, this may have had a superficial plausibility in an empty world, but now that we've moved into a full world, I think it's a fairy tale. Now, I've advocated for a long time the idea of a limited range, a maximum income as well as a minimum income. The minimum part has always had some political support. The maximum has really never had any support. It's been highly unpopular. But nowadays, thanks to the banksters on Wall Street, this idea is at least getting a little bit of support. Okay, number 4 that we might do, free up the length of the working day, week, and year. Allow greater option for part-time or personal work. Take more of our increased productivity in the form of leisure rather than extra goods and services which put an extra burden on the environment. Full-time external employment for all is hard to provide without continual growth. So other industrial countries have much longer vacations and maternity leaves and more flexible work schedules. For the classical economists, not the neoclassicals, the classical, the length of the working day was a key variable which the worker, the self-employed yeoman or artisan in their vision, he balanced the marginal disutility of labor against the marginal utility of the wage and of leisure in order to maximize total enjoyment of total lifetime. So I think this, under industrialism, however, the length of the working day ceased to be a variable under the control of the individual, of the worker, and became a parameter usually set by the employer, the capitalist, in that way. And indeed, the length of the working day for Karl Marx and in Marxist economics was a major part of the economy. This was what determined the rate of exploitation of labor and the rate of surplus value and many other things. So indeed, we ought to just free up that choice as much as possible. And there are various ways of doing it, but those need to be discussed a whole lot more. And we should stop biasing the labor-leisure choice, that is biasing it in favor of more labor in order to get more income to buy more stuff. We bias that by advertising, by stimulating the desire for consumption very much. Advertising, then, one little thing we ought to do, advertising should no longer be treated as a tax-deductible, ordinary, expensive business. You should have to pay your advertising costs out of after-tax profit. Well, okay, number 5 then, re-regulate international commerce. We talk all the time, second only to growth in the economist's credo of good things is free trade, free trade. Well, we need to move away from free trade, and we need to move away from free capital mobility and globalization, and adopt a system of compensating tariffs for protection. Protection of what? Not protection of inefficient firms domestically, that's kind of the old protectionism, but rather protection of efficient national policies of cost internalization against being undermined by standards lowering competition from countries that don't adopt those policies of cost internalization. This is the new protectionism. You're protecting efficient national policies from being undermined by standards lowering competition. You're not protecting inefficient domestic firms just from competition. Well, we cannot integrate with the global economy and at the same time have higher wages, higher environmental standards, and social safety nets than does the rest of the world. If you integrate, it's all going to be basically the same. So trade and capital mobility must be balanced and fair, not deregulated or free. Incidentally, tariffs are also a great source of public revenue and have been used as such historically very much in the U.S. Well, of course, obviously, if a policy like this would run directly counter to the World Trade Organization and all its rules, so that leads us to number 6, which would be to downgrade the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank to something very much like John Maynard Keynes's original plan at Bretton Woods, which was a plan for a multilateral payments union, a payments clearing union. And the idea of this plan was that all currencies would be defined in terms of the clearing unit, which Keynes called the Bancor, and penalty, and if you ran penalty rates would be charged on both surplus and deficit balances. So each country would have a balance in terms of bancors with the rest of the world. If you had a surplus balance or if you had a deficit balance, you would have to pay a penalty proportional to the size of that balance. The idea is that you force both sides of the imbalance, both the surplus and the deficit countries would have to take measures to balance their trade, and you would then get rid of longer imbalance of payment. So, well, that would be that would relieve the need for capital flows. The bancor would be very much like gold under the gold standard, only you would not have to dig it up out of the ground. You would just sort of create it as a unit of account. The IMF preaches free trade based on comparative advantage and has done so for a long time. More recently, the IMF, World Bank, WTO has started preaching the gospel of globalization, not part of their charter, but something they've added. Which, in addition to free trade, means principally free capital mobility internationally. And the classical comparative advantage argument for free trade explicitly assumes that capital is internationally immobile. When confronted with this contradiction, the IMF simply changes the subject. So the IMF, World Bank, WTO contradict themselves in service to the interests of transnational corporations. International capital mobility coupled with free trade allows corporations to escape from national regulation in the public interest, playing one nation off against another. Well, since there's no global government by which corporations are regulated, they are in effect uncontrolled. The nearest thing we have to a global government is precisely the IMF, World Bank, WTO, along with the United Nations, I suppose, and they have shown no interest in regulating transnational capital for the common good. So there's a big problem. Okay, number 7, which is the one I wanted to elaborate just a little bit more, is move away from fractional reserve banking toward a system of 100% reserve requirements. This idea of 100% reserve requirements I've taken largely from Frederick Soddy, who wrote in 1926, and at the same time in the 1920s, the leading American economists of that time, Irving Fisher of Yale and Frank Knight of the University of Chicago, both strongly advocated 100% reserve requirements. Well, that was 90 years ago, and the idea has gone underground, and there's great effort to keep it buried there, but I want to exhume it and bring it out again for consideration, because it seems to me to be just extremely sensible, but we can discuss that, and you can. Anyway, what's the idea? In order to really get all the way back, we'll have to go on a long detour, and I'm not going to take the time for that. So I'm just going to take it for granted that what is very clear, that with 100% reserve requirements, what that does is to take away from the private banking sector their ability to create money out of nothing and lend it at interest. They can no longer have a chain of redepositing and that ends up lending more money than it ends up lending a multiple of their reserve deposits. So this system, then 100% reserves, would put the control of the money supply and seigniorage in hands of the government rather than the private banks. They would no longer be able to create money out of nothing and lend it at interest, living, realizing the alchemist's dream. All quasi-bank financial institutions should be brought under this rule, regulated as commercial banks subject to 100% reserve requirements. How would banks earn their profit? Well, by financial intermediation, that is, lending savers money for them and charging a loan rate higher than the rate paid on savings accounts. Also, they could charge a service charge for checking, safekeeping, and other services. With 100% reserves, every dollar loaned to a borrower would be a dollar previously saved by a depositor. And that would reestablish the classical economic balance between abstinence and saving. So to invest, you have to abstain from consumption, save, and then have the funds available for investment. Well, as you move to such a system, we currently have a reserve requirement, which is very low, well below 10%. I'm not sure, it varies. We could raise that gradually. You have to do this, in one big jump. You could do it gradually up to 100. The government could do this by paying its own expenses by issuing more non-interest bearing fiat money in order to make up for the eliminated. Now, the bank created money is interest bearing money, so you get interest bearing demand deposit money out of the system, and you replace it by government issued currency, which is non-interest bearing money. The seigniorage earned on fiat money, that is the difference between the face value of the note and the negligible amount that it costs to produce the note, that is all earned then by the government. None of that goes to the private sector through the banking system. But the government can only print and issue currency, and in order to pay its own expenses, put it into circulation. It can only do this up to a strict limit imposed by inflation. If the government issues more money than people voluntarily want to hold, then people will spend it, they'll trade it for other assets and bid up the price of those other assets. So as soon as the price index begins to rise, as soon as inflation begins, that's a signal that the government has to change policy and stop issuing more currency and perhaps withdrawing some from circulation. So the policy of maintaining a constant price index would govern the internal value of the dollar. The external value of the dollar could be left to freely fluctuating exchange rates, or preferably to the rate against the Bancor and Keynes Clearing Union if that policy had been adopted. Well, a few more thoughts on how 100% reserves would serve the idea of a steady state economy or an ecologically based economy. Let me list 7 further thoughts on the idea of 100% reserves. What consequences would it have that would be beneficial? Well, first, as we've just discussed, it would restrict borrowing for new investment to the level of existing savings, greatly reducing the speculative growth ventures. For example, the leveraging of stock purchases with huge amounts of borrowed money would be severely limited. Why? Because in order to borrow that money, somebody else would have had to been saved previously by someone else, You couldn't just create money out of nothing to borrow and finance all sorts of idiotic ventures. Second, the fact that money no longer has to grow, the money supply no longer has to grow to pay back the principal plus the interest required by the loan that was responsible for the money's very existence. That lowers the general pressure to grow. Money becomes neutral with respect to growth rather than biasing the system toward growth. Why does it bias the system toward growth? By threatening to disappear. The money disappears unless new loans exceed repaid loans. So you have to always keep making new loans at interest to keep the money supply from disappearing, because it disappears when loans are repaid. Third, the financial sector will no longer be able to capture such a large share of the nation's wealth, leaving more available for meeting the needs of the poor. And also, I'd say it would, we would lower the size of the financial sector, which is currently absorbing all sorts of talents of really intelligent people, and would free them for more useful activity. Indeed, quite a few folks I've come in contact have already voluntarily freed themselves from this financial sector by just getting out of it and doing other things, because they recognize the social futility and of just grinding on this financial sector. Fourth, the money supply under 100% reserve requirements would no longer expand during a boom when banks like to loan lots of money, and then contract during a recession when the banks are trying to collect on their outstanding debts, thereby reinforcing the cyclical tendency of the economy. So the fractional reserve system reinforces the cyclical tendency of the economy. 100% reserve requirements would get rid of that reinforcement. And by reducing the risk of recession, it would reduce the incentive to accumulate more and more in order to get us through bad times. Fifth, with 100% reserves, there is no danger of a run on the bank leading to failure. And the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which insures deposits against failure due to a run on the bank, that could be abolished. And when you abolish it, you would also abolish its consequent moral hazard problems. That is to say, the danger of cascading collapse of the whole credit pyramid due to the failure of one or two banks that are too big to fail would be greatly reduced. Congress then could not be frightened and badgered into giving huge bailouts to the banking sector. I think this is a very important advantage. Sixth, the explicit policy of a constant price index would reduce fears of inflation and the resultant quest to accumulate more and more as a protection against inflation. And seventh, a regime of fluctuating exchange rates externally automatically balances international trade accounts, eliminating big international surpluses and deficits. So U.S. consumption would be limited if we could not run a larger and larger deficit. Chinese production growth would be limited if they cannot just keep on increasing their surplus. So making balance of payments lending unnecessary, the fluctuating exchange rates would shrink the role of the IMF and its conditionalities. Well, there are more things that could be said on that, but to conclude the issue of 100% reserve requirements, to dismiss such I would say, sound policies as extreme in face of the demonstrated fraudulence of our current financial system seems to me quite absurd. The idea here is not to nationalize banks, but rather to nationalize money. And money is, by its nature, a public utility in the first place. It should never have been privatized by a banking sector which then charges interest for its very existence. So I think this monetary system, 100% reserve requirement, makes very good sense independently of one's view on the steady state economy. But it does fit better into a steady state economy, I think, than into a growth economy. Okay, that's just a couple more. You've been very patient. Just a couple more and we'll open for discussion. Number 8, I think we should stop treating the scarce as if it were non-scarce, but also stop treating the non-scarce as if it were scarce. That is, we should enclose the remaining commons of rival natural capital, atmosphere, electromagnetic spectrum, public lands, etc., enclose those in public trust and price it by a cap auction trade system or by taxes, use that for public revenue, while at the same time freeing from private enclosure and prices the non-rival commonwealth of knowledge and information. So we've got a big commons out there. Some part of the commons is rival, some is non-rival. You have to separate the two. You have to treat the rival commons as scarce and enclose it, but at the same time you have to be careful to treat the non-rival commons as non-scarce and free it from enclosure. It's constantly being threatened by enclosure from private interests. Well, what is the part of the what is the non-rival commons? Mainly, I think, knowledge and information. Knowledge, unlike throughput or resources, is not divided into sharing, but is multiplied. So once knowledge exists, the opportunity cost of sharing it is zero, and its allocative price should be zero. International development aid should more and more take the form of freely and actively shared knowledge, along with small grants, and less the form of large interest-bearing loans. Sharing knowledge costs little, does not create unrepayable debts, and it increases the productivity of the truly rival and scarce factors of production. Existing knowledge is the most important input to the production of new knowledge. So keeping it artificially scarce and expensive is perverse from the point of view of stimulating the new production of knowledge, which is what patent monopolies are often supposed to do. So patent monopolies, or as they now say, intellectual property rights, should be given for fewer so-called inventions, and for fewer years. Costs of production of new knowledge should be financed publicly, and the benefits be made publicly available and freely shared. Well, that's something we can talk a lot about as well. Number 9, stabilize population. That is, work toward a balance in which births plus in-migrants equals deaths plus out-migrants for each country. Now, this is clearly very controversial and it's difficult, but as a start, could we not say simply that contraception should be made available for voluntary use everywhere? And while each nation can debate whether it should accept many or few immigrants and who should get priority, such a debate is rendered moot if immigration laws are not enforced. So democratically enacted immigration laws really ought to be enforced. And then how many legal immigrants one has is a matter of public discussion. It could be high, it could be low, it could be debated. We must debate it. So we should support voluntary family planning and enforcement of reasonable immigration laws democratically enacted. A whole lot of pro-natalist and open borders rhetoric claims nowadays to be motivated by generosity. But I suggest that it might be a generosity at the expense of the U.S. working class. That is to say, a cheap labor policy. Progressives, and I generally am a progressive on most issues, but I think progressives have been very slow to understand this. The environmental movement actually began, at least in the 1970s, it got a big push, initially with a strong focus on population, but since then has frequently sort of given way to political correctness and fear of offending potential contributors and so forth, and it's really put the soft pedal on population. Well, what am I saying? I'm saying that the danger here is a cheap labor policy. You listen to talk radio, and the whole immigration issue is usually spoken of in terms of race. Well, certainly there is a racial element to it, and that's a problem, ought to be really addressed. But under deeper class issue, and the class issue is between the U.S. employing class and the U.S. laboring class, and those interests are totally divergent with regard to high levels of immigration, particularly illegal immigration. That's just great for cheap labor. That busts unions and drives down wages enormously. So the people who really have been supporting, or at least some of the people supporting open borders and pro-natalist things, the Wall Street Journal, National Association of Manufacturers. Okay, this is a big political issue. What I'm basically saying is, yes, it is a racial issue. Deal with that. That has to be dealt with. But also deal with the fact that fundamentally it's a class issue, and we have divergent class interests in the United States. So at least recognize that. Number 10, reform national accounts. Separate GDP into a cost account and a benefit account. Don't try to add them all together. Compare them at the margin. Stop throughput growth when marginal cost equal marginal benefit. In addition to this, which is a fairly objective approach to measurement, recognize the importance of the subjective studies that show that beyond a certain threshold, further GDP growth does not increase self-evaluated happiness. Beyond the level already reached in many countries, GDP growth delivers no more happiness, but it continues to deliver more depletion, pollution, congestion, and loss of ecosystem services. So at a minimum, we must not just assume that GDP growth is economic growth. It may be uneconomic. We need to investigate that and prove it. Okay, that's the 10 policies that I want to put on board for discussion. These policies will appear radical to many people. I'd say that it's worth remembering that they are mostly amenable to gradual application. 100% reserve requirements can be approached gradually. Increase the reserve requirement by a few percentage each year. The range of distribution can be restricted gradually. Caps can be adjusted gradually, and so on. Also, all of these measures are based on the conservative institutions of private property and decentralized market allocation. They simply recognize that private property loses its legitimacy if it's too unequally distributed. So therefore, it can't be too unequally distributed or it's illegitimate. And that markets lose their legitimacy if prices do not tell the whole truth about opportunity costs. The efficiency of the price system depends upon prices measuring opportunity cost. In addition, the whole macroeconomy becomes an absurdity if its scale is structurally required to grow beyond the biophysical limits of the earth. Why would it be required to grow that much? In order to provide full employment, in order to avoid redistribution, and to create more and more military might, et cetera, et cetera. Well, before reaching that radical physical limit of growing beyond the biophysical capacity of the earth, we are encountering the conservative economic limit in which extra costs of growth, marginal costs of growth, are greater than the marginal benefits, ushering in the era of uneconomic growth, so far unrecognized, and which these 10 policies are offered to avoid or ameliorate. Okay, thank you for your patience, and so let's reverse the process here and let me listen to your comments and thoughts and questions for now.
Herman, can you hear now?
A little bit better.
Look on the top row of your computer keyboard. There might be a key with with a speaker symbol. Oh, you have a desktop. Do you have a set of headphones by any chance?
No, but I can hear you better now.
Okay. And is the volume up to maximum on this? Okay.
Yeah, I've got both my volume controls maxed.
Okay. So we'll have people talk right into the microphone when they have a question. So,
Okay,
yeah.
I can hear you good now.
Okay. Great. Thanks for that. I expect we might have a few questions.
Hey, Herman, John Isham from Middlebury.
Hi.
Thank you so much for doing this. I want to talk, I have a question for you about your reserve requirement proposal. That strikes me as not being radical, but exceedingly conservative. As an example, to illustrate this, some of my research is about loans here in Vermont to poor folk who need cars. And there's a credit union here who loans to them, given some incentives to do so. But that kind of loan illustrates what's possible without a 100% reserve requirement. So my concern is whether it's somebody who's desperate for a little capital to be able to go to a job on the labor side, or a small business that wants to install solar panels here in Vermont on the capital side, that would eliminate most of the loans from the small and community-based banks that we all know are the engine of our economy. And if I follow your currency proposal to counteract that, it seems to me then it leaves decisions about investments in the hands of a monetary authority, not local bankers who can sort of kick the tires of various proposals. So talk through to me what am I missing here?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It certainly is a conservative proposal, and I would appeal in the cases that you emphasized. There's the possibility of using seniorage on the money supply, the currency supply, as a means of financing some of these small loans. Also, I think this might open up a greater possibility for local currencies to meet these kinds of needs. I'm eager to learn more about how those have been working, and whether you in Vermont think that local currencies could finance solar panels and things like that, which we would want to see. So I think there's a real problem here in how much do you borrow against future technological growth and progress, and how much do you just on borrowing only against past savings. I mean, we're all going to hope for technical progress and solar and so forth, but how should its rate of introduction be limited by the willingness of people to abstain from consumption in order to finance that? Or should the willingness, or should it be constrained by our hopes for future progress and sort of borrowing from future increases, future projected increases in order to finance present investment? Certainly, I believe that the system that I've said really pushes us very much in the direction of borrowing from present consumption rather than estimated future progress. So I'll admit your questions or your points are good ones, and I'd like to hear what you or others think about it.
Thanks, Herman. And that the point about local currencies too, I think, is an important one as a way to implement your idea, at least at a smaller scale. One other point, the net effect of the privatizing the banking system has been a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. And so another positive effect of your system would be to stop that redistribution and start heading it perhaps back in the other direction.
Yes, I think that's true, and it would, I'm curious, maybe some of you have an idea, what happens to seniorage? Of course, under the gold standard, or a commodity currency, where the monetary value is equal to the commodity value of the money, there is no seniorage. But with a fiat currency that the government issues, there is this profit of, and for currency, it's clear that the seniorage goes to the government, the issuer of the currency, who is the first one to spend it. For the private banking sector, which creates demand deposits, what happened? The seniorage on the demand deposit, in the first instance, it goes to the banks, but then I think a lot of it must get competed away by the banking sector to its customers and to others, all mainly in the private sector. So I'm not too clear on what happens to that seniorage. But I think seniorage ought to be considered something like the commons. It's an asset that it's virtual wealth. It comes into existence as a result of community, and the community acts of establishing a currency and so forth. It should not be captured by private sector, and the idea that we have to create money out of nothing and lend it at interest and grant that privilege to some people in the private sector, as I said, I think that's just living the alchemist's dream, and needs to be addressed. I don't think, I think I'm trying to address it, so are some other people, but I don't think I've addressed it adequately, and I really am eager to hear more thoughts on that.
More questions. I should remind people that Herman's paper is available online at www.thesolutionsjournal.org. So if you want to refresh your memory about what he's just been talking about. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I think a lot of these policies sound like they're putting a lot of power in our government, and I'm just wondering where you see campaign finance reform in the mix, maybe, and if that might be added to these 10 policies.
Well, yes, I think that's a very good addition. Campaign finance reform. Um, I certainly, yeah, absolutely. Maybe if if the financial sector doesn't have all of this subsidization through the current fractional reserve system, maybe they won't have quite as much to give. But that's not an adequate answer. I definitely agree with finance. I've instituted my own personal political finance reform. I've just quit making donations to politicians across the board. You know, I'm willing to do some work for them or something, but I'm just not. You know, that has its own problems. Maybe it's selfishness on my part, but I'm just so disgusted. I don't want to give money to any political thing. I think we need to talk and work together independently of financing stupid sound bites on TV.
My question is a little more general. Maybe gradual application of these policies is the only way to go, but do we have enough time before our natural and social systems collapse?
Well, that's a good and difficult question. The direct and honest answer is I don't know how much time we have. I fear that we don't have a whole lot, and that things are at a dangerous level. We're so far in our politics and in economics from taking a position of urgency, which is what you're suggesting we need. We're just so far away from that it's I don't know of any other way to do but just try to initiate a discussion and say at least here are some things we could do, and we could do them. If you don't think there's much urgency, we could do them slowly. If you think it's urgent, we could speed them up. And my preference would be to move pretty fast. So that's about as good as I can answer that question. I really don't know how much time we have. I think we've already lost a hell of a lot. So we've already exceeded, sacrificed a great deal. So it's the sooner and faster we move, the better. On the other hand, there really are limits to how fast people can change their minds and policies. So there you are.
Okay, we have time for maybe one more question.
Hi, I'm wondering to what extent these policies really are biased in favor of current consumption and not so much in favor of innovation, and to what extent they really might further a kind of stagnation rather than the kind of flow that you talked about at the beginning.
I think the incentive or the impetus for innovation is comes through higher resource prices. So by raising the price of the resource throughput, we induce technical change to economize on the productivity of natural resources. In the past, most of our inducement to technical reform has been to economize on labor or land or capital. So I think, and we've done that, we've increased the productivity of labor by using more resources, increased the productivity of land by running through more energy and materials in agriculture and so on. So I think what's really ultimately scarce and destructive of the environment is the resource throughput. So we really need to increase its productivity and induce technical change in that direction towards resource productivity. And I think higher prices brought about by either cap and trade or by resource taxes would do that. Well, that, and I guess also, I think the issue of freeing up the non-rival commons, I think that would induce a lot of productivity. Indeed, just to take an immediate example, I wonder, I think this very nice communication via Skype is a part of the information commons now. And I rather wonder if there are not a lot of corporate entities looking for ways to privatize and grab hold of that and get it out of the commons. But I think this increases productivity. At least it saves resources. I don't have to spend the jet fuel to get up there to talk to you, and you don't have to spend it to come here. So anyway, those are two reasons why, or two avenues of productivity and technical improvement.
Thanks, Herman. Maybe one final question from our online audience. So we have some people who've written in, and one is, these policies are mainly aimed, it seems, at a national level. Do you think they're also applicable at the more local levels? And I guess maybe I would add at the global level. So how do they scale? Maybe is the question.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. You're quite right in the observation that they're focused at a national level. The reason for that is that that's where the policy levers and institutions of community mainly exist. So, and if we can do it at the national level, then maybe it can be replicated in terms of other nations. I'm all in favor of decentralizing within the nation as far as possible on the principle of subsidiarity. Whatever you can do locally, do it locally, and only kick it up to a higher level if it's necessary. And then finally getting it up to the global level. Certainly, eventually for many things, CO2 and all that, there's irreducible global problems there. I think that that we'll just have to do it by means of federation, and get some national policies in place first. Even if you could come to a global agreement about CO2, the enforcement and effectuation of that agreement would have to be carried out at national levels. So unless there are national institutions and policies to carry out some sorts of federated global agreement, then the agreement itself becomes rather useless. Although, we have to keep plugging in that direction. Another great area for further research and worry.
All right, let's thank Herman one last time.
Hey,